Hello, my name is Jane Nelson from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and I'd like to offer you all a warm welcome, those of you who are joining us here in person in Davos and online for this issue briefing on extreme weather, where we're going to focus on two key topics. First of all, what's happening and what are some of the key trends, and secondly, what role can business play in helping to manage and mitigate the risks of extreme weather. And it is clear that climate-related extreme weather events are intensifying, both in terms of their severity and frequency. Whether it's the devastating combination of floods and droughts that are impacting people's lives and food security in many parts of Africa, or it's deadly heat waves from Asia to Europe, or it's increasingly complex and challenging cyclone, hurricane, and tornado seasons, or it's large-scale and fast-moving wildfires that are destroying lives, homes, businesses, most recently in parts of South America, and of course, in the past few weeks, and as we sit here today, in Los Angeles. The evidence of climate-related extreme weather events is clear, it's compelling, and it's catastrophic. It's potentially catastrophic for the lives and the livelihoods and the security of millions of people around the world. It's potentially catastrophic for the resilience of communities, of businesses, especially small businesses and certain industry sectors, and for both local and national economies, and potentially catastrophic for public sector budgets and the ability of governments to both protect and support their citizens from dealing with both the risks and the impacts of extreme weather events. So where are we going? First, based on current evidence and projections, what can we expect in the future in terms of extreme weather events? And secondly, how can businesses become more effective, either individually or working in partnership with others, particularly governments, at planning for, responding to, and recovering from extreme weather events, both in terms of their own operations and supply chains, but also the communities and countries where they operate. And we are fortunate today to have two of the world's most respected and truly outstanding scientists and climate leaders to share their insights with us. Celeste Saulu, who is the Secretary General of the World Meteorological Organization, WMO, and Johan Rockström, who is the Director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. Wonderful to have you both with us. And so without further ado, where are we going? What can we expect? And Celeste, if we could start with you, what is WMO observing? And what are sort of some of the areas that we should be thinking more about, which we aren't hearing enough about?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this opportunity to share with you some thoughts from the World Meteorological Organization. And you have already mentioned that, and I will not repeat that much, but we have announced that 2024 was the warmest year on record, and that we had the 10 warmest years on the whole observational period. So as a result of this, and I'm sure that you have seen and read many of our reports and statistics, what we can experience are the effects of extreme events as a result of this warming. And extreme events, as you have highlighted, are floods, are droughts, are wildfires, are heat extremes also. And what we are seeing is that they are increasing and they are becoming more devastating. They are more intense and more frequent. That is what we see. And we also see that though we have better forecasts, we can save lives, but the economic impacts of these events are becoming larger. That is what we see. And the other, I would say, top evidence in this framework here at WEF to highlight is that this community in this last report highlighted that extreme weather events are between the most important risks to face. In 2 years time frame, and in 10 years time frame is the first one. So the question to this audience, and where WMO would like to put more the accent, is, so the perceived crisis is very clear. This group of stakeholders recognizes that extreme events are top risk. On the other hand, we know that weather information is relevant to address risks. And the question that we can ask is, are we doing enough to connect this perceived risk and the possible ways to navigate these risks? So I think that what we need to see, we would like to see, is bold climate action. And bold climate action implies more, of course, adaptation and mitigation strategies. So connecting the dots between the perceived risks and concrete actions is something that WMO would like to see and would like to be part of these solutions, of course, in this discussion. The other thing that we would like to discuss about is the impact of extreme heat. Extreme heat is what we call the silent killer. Extreme heat kills 500,000 people a year, more than tropical cyclones, more than floods, 30 times more than any of these severe weather events that you are well aware of. And what are we doing in terms of heat? We would like to see more reaction and more action in terms of heat, because heat affects human health, affects human productivity, affects energy, not only demand, but also production. So, and at the same time that we have heat, we have only 26 countries that their ministries of health use heat information for decision making. So that is again about connecting the dots between climate information and decision making. And that is why I'm here today. And I'm very glad to share this panel with you, because it's about linking the economic world with the climate information in a way that becomes very, I would say, relevant. According to, I would like just to mention that according to another report by WEF and Alliance, heat will be the costliest climate impact, and they expect 2.4 trillion in annual productivity losses by 2035 because of heat. So these are the kind of numbers that we should be handling together and tackling together. So I leave it here, and let's see how it evolves.
No, but I think that critically important point, and also sort of linking, the humanitarian risks and costs with the economic risks and costs together. Thank you, Johan. From your perspective.
Yeah, thanks. Just a few compliments to Celeste's excellent overview. Number one is that science shows clearly that extreme events don't operate in isolation from each other, just as Celeste points out, and just to re-emphasize the fact that the devastating extreme disaster we've experienced, for example, recently in Los Angeles, what is that? Is that an extreme fire? Of course it is an extreme fire, but it's not the fire that is the extreme event. The extreme event is a precursor to that, which is extremely high temperatures combined with drought. And then all water evaporates, the landscapes dry out because of that source extreme, which then cascades into causing a devastating fire. So you have this tendency of extreme events connecting to each other and amplifying even physically in the environment. We also know, just as Celeste pointed out, that extreme events spill over into massive health impacts. And you may have seen the first data concerns on collapse of functioning kidneys among sugarcane workers in South America, which very likely is related to heat stress, lethal heat stress, which is then a spillover effect from heat to health. So that is one thing that one needs to recognize. The second is that we've become so much better scientifically in our attribution studies. We're doing major analysis today showing with very, very convincing evidence the share of responsibility from anthropogenic cause behind extreme events. And I would argue today that one can have as a basic conclusion that there are no extreme events anywhere on planet Earth that do not have a sign, a signature from human-caused impacts. So we cannot talk anymore of natural extreme events. The question is not whether humans have influenced them or not. The question is to what extent. Is it 20%, 30%, 50%, or 70%? That's the question today. So we often get confused in media where the question is, did we cause this or did we not cause this? Well, I can assure you that science is very clear here that today we cannot disconnect ourselves between extreme events and human influence. And of course, this is a very complex science. There's a lot of uncertainty ranges, but that's the point we've reached. And then I'd like to also just emphasize one thing that I think is important in the discussion on extreme events, which is that, just as Celeste points out, we've gone through the most socially and economically costly year in human existence on planet Earth with regards to extreme events, 2024. We do know that this is the first time we touch 1.5 degrees Celsius, the limit we've agreed in the Paris Climate Agreement. But that is not the same thing as saying that we've breached the IPCC 1.5 limit, because that is based on the scientific assessment on the moving 10-year average. But the best scenarios today show that we will be breaching 1.5 in a scientific assessment by 2030 to 2035, meaning in just 5 to 10 years, that we will be, let's call it for the moment, permanently beyond 1.5. We will then enter a period of overshoot. And this overshoot will at best be a 30-40 year period of up to 1.8 degrees Celsius, according to the best scenarios that can still hold 1.5 in the IPCC AR6 C2 group of scenarios. Those of you who follow this, these are the SSP1, SSP2, RCP 1.9 scenarios that hold 1.5 but after overshoot. And that we would come back at best to 1.5 by the end of this century. It all requires a full decarbonization of the global economy, and that the planet won't send any additional invoices to us in terms of tipping points or losing carbon uptake capacity. Now, what does that mean in terms of extreme events, to close this? Well, it means with very high degree of, very high likelihood that it will get worse before it potentially gets better in terms of frequency and amplitudes of droughts, floods, heat waves, disease outbreaks, and human-reinforced storms and hurricanes. That's the future we're facing. So we may be looking back at 2024, the most expensive year in human history, as a relatively harmonious year, because we're in for a tougher future before it gets better. And it will only get better if we really deliver on the mitigation agenda. So that is also part of this equation, which connects to Celeste's point that we're starting to see economic analysis that shows that already now extreme events are costing the economy double-digit numbers. I mean, you find many publications today showing 10, 15, the latest 18% drawdown on global GDP by 2050 if we continue in the current pace, just on lethal heat and loss of labor productivity. So these are not small impacts anymore.
Thank you both. And given what you've both outlined, you're clearly, these scenarios are creating major risks for business, but also incredible responsibilities from business in terms of playing a more proactive role. And I'd be interested to hear both of your views in what do you think companies can and should be doing more of or getting better at when it comes to both managing and mitigating the risks of extreme weather events, both to their own operations and supply chains, but also to the communities and countries where they're operating. And Celeste, if we could start again with you, and I know you recently collaborated, and I strongly recommend this World Economic Forum report on catalyzing business engagement in early warning systems. So maybe you can share some of your key insights from this, but also other actions that you would call on business to take in playing a more active leadership role.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this question. And certainly it was a pleasure for WMO to be part of this report. And for me, it was a pleasure to read it. I did not write it, but I read it very attentively. And I think it's very interesting to see how much opportunities do business have in terms of early warnings. And I will go back to my previous intervention in terms of linking the dots. No? So why should, what do we expect in terms of business responsibilities and business opportunities? And I think that my first reaction is to say, well, businesses should invest in better early warnings. Why? Because here it is clearly demonstrated that the return on investment, for each dollar you put on early warnings, you get 9. These are the numbers for the developed world. But if you go in the developing world, in areas in Southeast Asia, South America, or Africa, the return on investment can go from 1 to 19. Is there any better investment at your site? But certainly, it's about avoiding losses. And sometimes businesses do not engage straight in avoiding losses. But in the end, we know that we need to avoid losses to make profitable our businesses. So I think that why should we invest in early warnings? So the return on investment is clear, one. Second, 50% of the world does not have good early warning systems. So if you have a business that is run in places where you don't have an early warning system, that business is much more exposed. So having the possibility to improve the early warning systems is unique. And I think here is where the connection between the businesses and the meteorological and hydrological water services are so important, because in the end, the early warning system is part of a big value chain between getting the information and having better forecasts. And that is what you need to really do and take better decisions. It's about decision making. So risk mitigation for a business, from a business perspective, is only possible if you have information. And what early warnings do is that they provide information, reliable information for decision making. So I think that businesses have many roles to play in early warnings, from being users, from being partners, from being innovators, and from being, of course, vendors of these systems. So it's about using innovation, AI, data. Data is all over the place, but using good data is the main issue here. And that's why the partnership with Met Services is so important, and with the academia, of course, because you need to ingest this information into the value cycle of every single operation. So I would say that, just to close this intervention, that the World Bank has estimated that universal access to early warning systems would result in total avoided annual losses of 35 billion a year investing in early warnings. So businesses and early warnings should go hand by hand, and that's my point.
Business case we need to make more strongly. Before I come to Johan, we will be coming to the audience if any of you have got a question, so be ready for that. But Johan, what's your call to action to business?
I think business has a great opportunity, but also a very high degree of responsibility to map risks of extreme events across their entire value chains and put that information out in the public. And I think that should be made compulsory, basically, because that's what shareholders should understand, that these are threats to the value of companies and the profitability of companies. There are example of studies now shared confidentially just yesterday, the World Business Council Sustainable Development, that members doing assessment of extreme event risks for their businesses, particularly in the food and beverage industry, that could potentially, within the next 5-10 years already, end up in a situation where you have zero net profit because of the costs that are not avoided due to less cacao and all forms of inputs for food and beverage provision into the industry. So this is information that business should bring forward in ways that I think also can help us in regulatory measures and policymaking. Secondly, I think the exponential rise in extreme events across the world, and particularly Celeste's point about heat, which is the most expensive and the most fundamental one and the most universal one. Remember that Europe has been hit twice now by devastating heat waves in 2022 and looking back to the 2003, 60 to 70,000 premature deaths estimated at that moment. Now, I think that suggests that we should no longer allow any actor, but certainly not business, to separate adaptation from mitigation. There is a tendency, of course, that once you take extreme events seriously and you do it in a conventional way, that puts all your investments in adaptation. You kind of adapt, cope with the extremes. That is understandable, but given that if we don't also do mitigation, that the invoices will just rise, I think calls for changing the entire approach to say that what we now have to do in business is focus entirely on resilience building and define resilience as a zero carbon adaptive capacity, meaning phase out the cause of the problem as quickly as possible, and while doing so, also build more adaptive capacity. And I think that is something that we've been trying to propagate also or advocate within the missions initiatives in the European Union and bring up in the climate negotiations. And I think certainly that also calls for the business community to integrate adaptation and mitigation into resilience agenda to be able to be more effective in addressing the years ahead.
Great. Well, thank you. Time for one or two very quick questions, if there are any from the audience. You introduce yourself. Yeah.
Just a very basic one about statistics. Do we have already statistics about the intensity and the frequency of the extreme weather events, which are the two factors that have been making the change? Thank you.
I can answer very briefly, but certainly Johan will provide more exact numbers. The IPCC report highlights that this as very likely to have more extreme events and not more intense, more frequent, and that's where we stand. Currently, our organization, the World Meteorological Organization, reports every year the main extreme events, and so we have the occurrence, the actual occurrence. In terms of the projections, we know that we will have more, but I leave that to Johan.
No, but I think it's really important in this room to just remind that in the IPCC AR5, the fifth assessment, we did not have enough scientific evidence to say that frequency is increasing. We could only conclude that amplitude is increasing. So that extreme events were getting more severe, but we did not have statistical significant evidence on the frequency. The sixth assessment is the big landmark shift there. It's the first time that science now shows that both frequency and severity are rising across all extreme events. And of course, there are numbers there. I wouldn't like to try and give you the exact numbers, but I would recommend you to look at not only the IPCC, but something called EasyMIP. EasyMIP is the platform, the scientific community doing the climate impact assessments, which then inform Working Group 2 of the IPCC. And if you just Google EasyMIP, you'll come to the repository of all the information of mapping, not only today frequency and amplitude of extreme events, but actually also increasingly how these interact.
Well, thank you very much. We are out of time. We've got a couple of minutes. We've got one last one there.
Thank you. I'm Uwe Häuser of Die Zeit in Germany. Professor Rockström, I was wondering, I totally support what you say about a combination of mitigation and adaptation. I'm wondering how you perceive the atmosphere right here, also within business discussions about climate mitigation and climate control. I mean, this week has been scarred by the US expectedly getting out of Paris, and of course, before that, many financial companies in the US leaving global climate alliances. What do you perceive here?
Well, to begin with, it is a dark moment in our efforts of having policy, business, and the global economy to align with the scientific evidence, for sure. It is a real worry that having US stepping out of the Paris Agreement, to be honest, not so much because at least I personally fear the US, because the US has come so far in investing in renewable energy technologies and so many of the states in the US, and the IRA is very difficult to see how one would back off from the Inflation Reduction Act. The nervousness is what spillover effects this can have on other countries in the world. And that in turn can end up in a serious slowdown of efforts. I'm thinking of Saudi Arabia, I'm thinking of Argentina, I'm thinking of some of the more populist governments now in Europe, making it more difficult for the European Union to stay on track on the Fit for 55 legislation, the ETS2, the emission trading scheme that is now going to integrate agriculture and transport sector into the whole emission trading scheme. You know, if that succeeds according to the plan, this will very likely bring the price on carbon above 100 euros per ton of carbon dioxide. If that is combined with a carbon border adjustment mechanism, the world was lined up actually for a pathway towards a price on carbon, and now that might actually be you know, not completely dropped, but we may have a slowdown in that work. So it is a real concern. I would happily share with you, though, that I just came from the CEO leadership lunch here at WEF, so over 100 CEOs of big multinational companies in the world. And the message there is that we're not deviating from the plans we have. We're staying on track. We're moving on a decarbonization path. We're electrifying our industry. We're not going to be shaken up by what's happening. So I think we are meeting right at a point of uncertainty, actually, that where will we tip over the coming years? And of course, I should just close by saying that, you know, the IPCC told us very clearly that a chance of holding 1.5 degrees Celsius required bending the global curve of emissions 2020 to cut emissions by half by 2030. Now we're halfway in this decade and we're still increasing emissions. So now we have 5 years and the global carbon budget is shrinking to move, citing UNEP, at a pace of 7 to 8% reductions in global emissions each year to reach that 50% reduction by 2030, to have a chance of a landing at net zero by 2050. So of course it's nervous to at exactly that moment when we need to accelerate our pathway to have this risk at least. So at least my view is that it's not a complete halt of the efforts, but it's definitely a concerning moment. Yeah. I don't know what you think, Celeste.
No. Well, no, certainly. I think that the Paris Agreement is, I would say, there is a momentum in the Paris Agreement that we must hold on, and it's about all the transformations that brought to the table, and we must continue along those lines. I think that is the positive message that we should embrace.
Great. No, well, thank you, Johan and Celeste. I think 3 key takeaways. First of all, the humanitarian economic risks and costs of extreme weather events, climate-related extreme weather events are increasingly clear. Secondly, clearly governments have to take the lead, but business has a growing responsibility to manage and mitigate the risks not only in their own businesses and supply chains, but also more broadly. An enormous opportunity for partnerships, and I think that the opportunity for more partnerships in the area of early warning systems and aligning the mitigation and adaptation agendas is particularly valid. So thank you very much, and thank you for being with us.